One of the biggest concerns with really any technology is, of course, security. What we want to be able to do is we want to be able to limit access to resources to only the people who need access to said resources. And what we're going to see is that there's a couple of different steps that we need to walk through to be able to limit and restrict access to those resources. And what we're going to start off with in this lesson here, Windows Authentication in SharePoint, is how we can authenticate or prove that our users are who they say they are by utilizing Windows Authentication. We'll talk about a couple of the other providers that are available as well, but we're going to delve into those a little bit deeper in later lessons. We'll also go in and see the impact that IIS is going to have as well on our Windows authentication and how exactly the username and password is going to be sent from the client up to the server. But let's start off by talking a little bit about authentication, authorization, and exactly what each one of these are, because they are quite frequently used interchangeably. Authentication is the process of you proving that you are who you say you are. Authorization is the process of you proving that you have permissions to perform whatever action it is that you're trying to perform. And it's always going to be those two steps. Step one is I need to show I am who I say I am. Step two is now I can show that I have access to whatever it is that I'm looking for. When it comes to authentication, I always like the following analogy. Picture, if you will, that you're going to check in for a flight. So you walk up to the counter, and the first thing that the ticket agent is going to ask you for, of course, is some form of ID. That's going to be your authentication mechanism. That's going to be how you're going to prove that you are who you say you are. Now, depending on where you are and where it is that you're trying to travel to, the mode of authentication can vary. So, for example, if I'm flying domestically within the US, all that I need is a driver's license. But if I'm going to be flying international, then in that case, I'm going to need a passport. And just like depending on where you are and what it is that you're trying to accomplish in real life, things might change. The exact same thing holds true in SharePoint. That the modes of authentication that I have available to me are going to be different depending on what it is that I'm looking to do with SharePoint. Now, the second step is authorization, and going back to my analogy, that's going to, of course, require whoever the ticket agent is to punch the million or so keys into the keyboard. Well, but anyway, so it requires the ticket agent to go ahead and pull up my reservation, and eventually they're going to confirm that, yes, in fact, I do have a ticket. They'll go ahead and print my boarding pass, and then away I go from there. Now, authorization in SharePoint is going to be handled in a couple of different ways. Then we're going to see that we're going to be able to apply permissions at a web application level, at a site level, at a list level, at an item level, and so forth. And we'll get into all of that later. For right now, our focus is on authentication, and again, in particular, on Windows authentication. As I mentioned, SharePoint provides multiple ways for handling authentication. At the highest level, we have two main options when it comes to allowing for authentication at the web application level. The first option that we have is classic authentication. Classic authentication is now obsolete. This is now deprecated. In later versions of SharePoint, this is not going to be supported any longer. Classic authentication is basically what we had going back to, say, the days of SharePoint 2007, and it was there actually in 2010 as well. But the biggest challenge with classic authentication is that it's Windows authentication only. One of the things that we're going to get into as we start to get into other forms of authentication is that can be a little bit limiting. Because I may need to allow vendors access to my site. I may need to allow external facing users access to my site as well. And giving them all Windows accounts, yeah, that's not necessarily going to work. So having Windows only as the option is going to be rather restrictive, is going to be rather limiting. And so classic authentication is now obsolete. Interestingly enough, classic authentication can only be configured through PowerShell. There is no UI for classic authentication. Classic authentication is also not a best practice. You should instead use claims-based authentication. Now, the great thing about claims-based authentication is that it essentially allows for any form or any mode of authentication that we might want. In fact, we can actually have multiple modes of authentication on the same web application. So if maybe I have some external clients that are going to be working on site, I might go ahead and set up an ADFS relationship between us and their forest, and then allow them to be able to access my SharePoint implementation by using their own accounts. And then, of course, for my own local users, they just carry on using Windows authentication just as they always did. Claims-based authentication is the only option that's going to be available to me inside of central administration. Now, one of the little catches, and we've actually seen this in prior demos, is the fact that claims-based authentication, while it's the only thing that I can do inside of central administration through the UI, in PowerShell, this is actually not the default. It's one of those things that I personally find a little bit interesting. I really do wish that this was the default in PowerShell. So in PowerShell, I need to set up my authentication provider and then make sure when I create my web application that I point that at it. So that way it will actually use claims-based authentication. But again, through the UI, claims-based authentication is going to be the default. Regardless of the mode of authentication that we choose, be it classic or claims-based, we always have available to us the option of doing anonymous authentication. Anonymous authentication, in a nutshell, is going to allow your users to be able to access data without providing any form of credentials, without providing any form of a username or a password. Now, most commonly, this is going to be done for public-facing sites. One of the coolest features that's available to you in SharePoint Server is a little feature called publishing. And what publishing allows is for your users to actually be able to create content, but do so in a controlled environment. So what I can do is I can allow my users to go off and maybe create a brand new job posting. Meanwhile, when they actually create that little page, behind the scenes, they're actually just creating a list item, which I could then go off and set up on a workflow. So I can make sure that maybe it hits the legal department so they can look over everything, and hits the web team so that way they can look over everything. And then eventually that page will be published out to the public. Now, of course, if I have a public-facing site, I don't necessarily want everybody to authenticate, or at least not to authenticate to be able to access everything on the site. And this is where that anonymous access comes into play. So I can do that for my public-facing sites. Now, in order for anonymous authentication to work, this must be configured at the web application level. The reason for this is the web application, if you remember from earlier, is the plugin, if you will, is the front end, is the connector to the website inside of IIS. And it's IIS, really at the end of the day, that makes the authentication magic happen. That in order for any form of authentication to take place, IIS needs to be told about it. So if we're going to be doing Windows, IIS needs to handle that. If we're doing forms-based authentication, IIS needs to handle that. And if we're doing anonymous, where basically we're going to be turning off authentication, then IIS also needs to be aware of that. And so since it's something that needs to be done at the website in IIS, it's something that needs to be done in the web application inside of SharePoint. Turning on anonymous access at the web application is basically like kicking on the master switch in your house. That all that it's going to do is make anonymous access available, but it's not actually going to give anybody any level of access, any level of permissions into your site. that what I actually need to do down at the site collection, down at the site, or even potentially down to the list level is go in and configure whether or not I want to allow anonymous access. So that way, if there are portions of your site that I want to reserve for only specific people, for maybe just members, that I still have that capability. So I can turn on anonymous authentication, but not necessarily just open up the entire castle for everybody to be able to peruse. Now, to enable anonymous authentication, all that we need to do is fire up central administration, go to Manage Web Applications, choose the web application in question, and then click Authentication Providers. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice about our authentication providers is that they can be configured on a zone-by-zone basis. Now, if you remember from an earlier lesson, zones allow us to basically set up multiple buckets, multiple different access points, multiple ways that we can access the exact same web application. So I might have, for example, a SharePoint implementation that's dual homed, that maybe we've got it both public facing as well as internal facing. And so I might decide, depending on which URL it is that you're using to access it, that I want the permissions to be set differently. And that's one of the big things that I can do with zones. Now, in my case here, I just have the one zone, just the default zone. So I'm just going to click on that. And then what you're going to notice is that we have Enable Anonymous Access. Now, in my case here, Enable Anonymous Access is already checked. The default, however, is for not enabling anonymous access. So if you did actually want it, you would have to come back into here and put the little check there. Now, in my case, for right now, I really don't want anonymous access. So I'm just simply going to take that check away, and then I'm going to scroll the rest of the way down here in this little screen, and then I'm going to click Save. And just like that, I've now disabled anonymous access. Typically, for most internal SharePoint implementations, you're not going to want anonymous access. Quite frequently, for most public-facing, you will want anonymous access. But as always, depending on where you are, depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish, that may change. Let's turn our attention now to, by far, the most common mode of authentication in SharePoint, and that is going to be Windows authentication. Windows authentication is the most common scenario because it uses the infrastructure that you already have in place. You already have Active Directory deployed. All of your users inside your network all already have accounts. They all already have usernames and passwords. So let's just go ahead and take advantage of what we've already got. In addition to that, depending on how we set up our Windows authentication, depending on how we set up our internet and intranet zones inside of Internet Explorer, our users' authentication can actually be completely seamless inside of SharePoint, so they don't even know that they've authenticated, that they just simply fire up the browser, connect to our SharePoint site, and then away we go. Now, the thing about Windows authentication is that it is going to be the default option. But even though Windows authentication is going to use our Windows usernames and passwords to connect, there's actually 3 different ways that IIS will accept Windows authentication. The first mechanism is integrated authentication. Integrated authentication is the most common form of authentication. The reason for this is because if you're using Internet Explorer or Firefox, then what can happen is my user just simply sits down at their desktop, they log on to Windows, they fire up the browser, they connect to my SharePoint site, and behind the scenes, my token will automatically be passed along to SharePoint. The problem, however, with integrated authentication is the fact that it will only work with Internet Explorer and with Firefox, and it's also generally not going to be compatible with proxy servers, firewalls, and other devices that can get between my system and the eventual SharePoint implementation. To open things up a little bit more, we also have digest authentication. The catch with digest authentication is that it does require usernames and passwords stored in a reversible encryption, which is generally speaking not something that I want. The last option that we have is basic authentication. Now, what basic authentication will allow us to do is it will allow us to accept authentication from any browser from basically anywhere in the world. Why? Well, because it's going to send your password and your username in clear text. Your security tip for the day: sending a username and password in clear text is not a best practice. So if you are going to use basic authentication, then you will also want to ensure that you enable SSL for that web application, so that way the username and password will be encrypted. Now, you might be wondering, why in the world would you ever want to enable basic authentication? Well, one reason that you might decide to enable this is if I have an extranet site where my users are internal network users, but they want to be able to access SharePoint from the outside world as well. So one thing that we might decide to do to allow them access over the internet is just enable basic authentication. So they fire up their copy of Chrome, and then what's going to happen is they're going to be prompted for a username and a password. They type that in, they hit OK, and then they're going to be authenticated and able to connect and do whatever it is that they might want to do inside of SharePoint. The other little advantage that basic authentication has is the fact that it will always prompt me for a username and a password. What's advantageous about that is the fact that if I'm trying to do some level of testing and I want to be able to very easily log on as somebody else, basic authentication is going to enable that. Because every time that I fire up my browser and I go to connect to the site for the first time, it's then going to prompt me for a brand new username and password. If I've done a little bit of testing and now I want to log on as a different user, then all I have to do is close out my browser, open it back up, connect to the site, and I'll be prompted again. So for testing purposes, or for potentially an extranet application, basic authentication can be the way to go. Now, one thing that you're going to notice about these authentication options is that they don't exist inside of your web application in SharePoint. Basically because it's actually not really SharePoint that's going to be handling your Windows authentication. It's going to be IIS. So those settings are going to be configured inside of IIS. Let's go take a real quick look at the dialog box and where you would configure that inside of IIS if you wanted to. What I'm going to do is go back to my start menu here, and I'll just type IIS, and we'll hit our little button there. And what you're going to notice is under my sites, I've got my SharePoint intranet sites. Now, inside of here, you're going to notice that I've got my authentication settings. So I'm just going to double click on that, and this is where you're going to notice my basic, my digest, and my Windows authentication. That my Windows authentication is going to be that integrated authentication. My basic and digest are going to be, well, basic and digest respectively. Now, what you're going to notice is that if I want to enable any one of these, then all that I need to do is just simply right-click on it and then hit enable, and now basic authentication would be available for that site as well as Windows authentication, which then begs the next question, which is, well, if you enable both basic and Windows, which again remember is integrated authentication, then which is IIS going to go with? Well, fortunately, IIS will go with the most secure mechanism that it can, which would mean that it's going to start with integrated authentication, and then step down to digest authentication, and then step down to basic authentication. So in this scenario here, what would happen is it would start off with the integrated authentication, and if it can't authenticate me, then it will step down to basic authentication. And again, if I want to turn that off, then all I have to do is just simply right-click and hit disable. Once we're authenticated to IIS and in turn to SharePoint by using Windows Authentication, there's the matter of our token and how our token is going to be created. And our token can be created using NTLM or using Kerberos. Now, NTLM, NT Land Manager, is the old style way of handling authentication. And as a result, it's slower and less secure. However, the big advantage that NTLM offers us is that it does not require any additional configuration. That my token is just simply passed into SharePoint, and then away we go from there. The big problem, however, with NTLM is this little concept of a two-hop. That if I'm sitting at my desktop, I fire up my browser and I connect to SharePoint. And on the SharePoint page that I'm looking at, it fires up a web part. And that web part needs to be able to connect out to a database, and it wants to do so as me. That's now two hops. That I'm connecting to SharePoint, and then my credential is going to be passed from SharePoint back to the database. NTLM does not support two-hop authentication. This is where Kerberos comes into play. Now, Kerberos, in case you're curious, is the name of the three-headed dog that guards the gates of Hades. True story. It's also an open standard form of authentication, and it's what Active Directory uses. Now, there's a lot of great advantages to Kerberos. That it is going to be faster, it is more secure, and it does support two-hop authentication. The big challenge, however, with Kerberos authentication is that it does require what are known as SPNs, or service principal names, for every single moving part between SharePoint, SQL, and anything else that I might eventually be able to connect to. The reason for that is because those services are going to be passing around these tokens. So SharePoint would pass my token back to SQL Server. In order for that to take place, Active Directory needs to trust SharePoint, and it needs to trust SQL. So SPNs need to be created. Unfortunately, there is no UI for creating your SPNs. That the command line utility is set SPN, and this will need to be created again for SQL as well as for every single SharePoint web application and a few other applications inside of SharePoint as well. While it does require some additional configuration, it is considered a best practice. There is our SharePoint authentication. I'm going to see you in the next lesson.